Well, hello and welcome. The other day, I read this in the Wall Street Journal. Is it fair that our kids and grandkids and great-grandkids will have to pay off the $5 trillion of debt accumulated over the past 4 years without any benefits to them? Now, that struck me as wrong in a lot of different ways. And the person I immediately thought of in terms of helping me figure out how, and all the different ways, that's a misguided statement, is my friend and colleague here at the Center on Budget, Richard Kogan. So Richard, if you could tell me your reaction to that statement. Is it fair that our kids and great-grandkids will have to pay off the $5 trillion of debt accumulated over the past 4 years without any benefits to them?
Well, I think of that statement as having a kernel of truth before being wrong in two fundamental ways.
Okay.
And so I'd like to start with the ways in which it's wrong and then finally acknowledge the ways in which it's right.
Great.
Okay. So what I first focus on is the phrase, without any benefit to them. I think that that's fundamentally wrong, but it doesn't have to be wrong. If the United States, in fact, did what some right-wing commentators think it did, which is that it takes money in and then burns it and dumps the ashes in the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean, then any amount of...
Bipartisan, because it's
Right.
the Atlantic and the Pacific. Right.
Absolutely, bicoastal.
Bicoastal.
Then any amount of debt, $100, $5 trillion.
If it's all waste.
If it's all waste, it's not fair.
Right.
It's also, if it's all waste, it's not fair even if there's no debt involved, even if you're charging taxpayers right now for that $100 of waste. That's not fair to current taxpayers. So you need to think about the extent to which you believe that government spending constitutes waste. Most government spending is, the biggest single program is Social Security, the next biggest is Medicare, the next is the national defense structure, which has successfully kept us from being invaded for a really long time, and so on and so forth, unemployment insurance. And one can make comments on this, but if you reject the notion that the purposes and effects of government constitute 100% waste, and think that the United States government does at least as well as the average private sector entity in avoiding waste, and I think that, then the premise of this is wrong.
Okay, so first mistake is the without any benefits to them clause. Okay,
Right.
Next.
Okay. To illustrate that, let's look at this graph, graph 1. What this graph shows you is the debt over the last 100 years.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
Well, you know, I want to have a little bit of historical perspective
here,
on
yeah.
this. It shows it on a semi-log scale, so we're showing growth rates.
This is nominal debt held by the public.
The public, right.
Okay, just growing over 100 years. There must be a spike here for some wars, right?
Yeah, this first spike is World War I. Okay.
World War I, World War II, I would guess.
That's right.
Okay.
And before World War II, this buildup was the Great Depression, then World War II, then there was the Reagan, first Bush period.
Okay.
Then there was Clinton, in which it actually
Okay, so,
got, and then there's the recent,
yes. Actually,
Depression.
that's worth looking at. Then there's the recent uptick here in debt, which
Well,
is very much related to
That's right. This recession, the biggest
recession.
one since the Great Depression.
All right. So there it is, folks. Debt over 100 years.
Okay. So to think about this in the most obvious way, the debt that we incurred in winning World War II, is it worth my paying for that? You bet it's worth my paying for that.
So
Every penny
there's
of
a
it is worth
benefit.
it. That's right. But more broadly speaking, the United States regularly has done things that are not quite as obvious as that. It's done the GI Bill. It sends kids to college through Pell Grants and student loans, and has for decades. It's made a Social Security system that has meant that we don't all have to keep our mothers or grandmothers in the back room and tend to them personally, and so on and so forth.
So let's stipulate that part of the argument.
And so therefore, the not any benefit
Right.
to you means also to your parents and
Well, that's a good point.
Your parents, your grandparents who got educated, who allowed you to become what you are.
These benefits redound over generations.
They certainly do. Good word, redound. Nonetheless, you will also see from this graph that debt is very rarely repaid.
Okay, so
Okay.
here is another key point to why this is wrong.
That's
Debt is very rarely repaid. Explain that.
Okay. As you see from the graph, when debt goes up, in nominal terms at least, we borrow a lot of money, and then we don't repay. Yes, we pay the bills. We don't default on the bills, but we do that by borrowing from somebody else to pay off the current bondholders.
We roll over the debt.
We roll over the debt. There's a little period in which debt got a little bit repaid after the end of World War I, and at the end of the Clinton administration, there was some debt repayment.
But
But
you will
broadly
note
speaking, it just goes up.
it doesn't go to zero.
It does not go to zero. It doesn't even go down. It goes
Right.
up.
Okay, good.
Okay, is that a problem? Well, it turns out that if you don't repay debt, you have to pay interest on it, and that economists who are also good at algebra will prove to you that paying interest forever is functionally the same as paying down the debt to zero. It just spreads it over forever. But it's a real cost. So accumulating cost does have a cost for future generations.
Accumulating debt does have a
Accumulating
cost.
debt. Accumulating debt does have a cost for future generations. That's the kernel of truth in the statement. The big lie was without any benefit to them.
Right.
Okay, but the reality is that we accumulate debt, we don't pay it back, and therefore we have to pay interest on it forever.
Let me interject the second, what I think is the second, fundamental mistake here. It riffs off exactly what you've just been saying. The question asks, is it fair that our kids will have to pay off the $5 trillion of debt accumulated over the last 4 years? No one's ever paid off the debt. The debt gets rolled over.
But they will have to pay, and this is the kernel of truth, they will have to pay interest on that $5 trillion of debt
That's
forever.
true. That's
okay,
true.
and so therefore one has to address that reality, because it is a reality, and ask that question: is it fair that they're paying interest on it, even though we grant that they got benefits
All right,
out
so
of
just
it, they and their parents and their
to
grandparents
make the
and so on.
conversation manageable here, answer that part of the question, and then we'll close this out for now, because I don't want to tax our viewers too much here.
So the next question is, how hard is it to pay that interest forever? Well, the real question isn't how much debt you have, but how that debt relates to your income. So if you look at graph number 2, you'll see that over the same 100-year period, leaving aside the Great Depression, over the same 100-year period, the economy of the United States, the tax base, grew forever. It grew and grew and grew and grew and grew. It was $50 billion worth of GDP in 1910, and now it's about $15 trillion in GDP.
Right.
And so the real question is whether your debts grow faster than your income, not whether you have debts.
I see.
When you graduate college, you may have some college debts. 10 years later, you may have paid off your college debts, but now have a much bigger debt, your mortgage and your car debts.
So let me
but
just-
if you have more income, it's not a problem.
So the issue is not just your nominal debt, it's your nominal debt relative to your nominal income, which I suspect is the next chart.
And the next chart shows your nominal debt relative to your nominal
We didn't even
income.
plan it that way.
Oh, yes, we did. or your real debt relative to your real income. And what this shows is the same sort of phenomena before the World War I, the Great Depression, World War II. Big number. As you saw before, after World War II, we did not pay off the debt. We didn't reduce it practically at all. And yet, the burden of the debt fell dramatically from 1945 to 1980 because the income of the United States grew far faster than the debt that we weren't paying off. That's what really counts, economic growth.
I understand.
And if you've got enough economic growth so that the economy over normal times, not during recessions obviously, but over normal times, grows faster than the debt, then the debt burden shrinks. The amount of money your kids are paying in interest relative to their income shrinks.
Right.
And it can shrink dramatically.
Right.
And so therefore, the amount of money that I'm paying on my parents' World War II debt is trivial as well as the benefits being huge.
Of winning World War II.
Yeah.
So let's collect our findings and conclude. Number one, it's absolutely wrong to think about this as if there are no benefits to the debt that we incur. Right? We've clearly emphasized that point. Number two, it's wrong to imagine that we ever completely pay off our debt. As you've seen from Richard's figures, that's not the case. The question is, how does that debt increase or decrease relative to the income and the rest of the economy, relative to GDP, recognizing that there is an interest burden. So here, before we close out, I don't want to forget, though, that at the end of this graph, you see a very sharp uptick again.
Right.
And for those who want to be worried about this kind of a movement upward in the debt to GDP ratio, just tell us what do you have to say to them?
Okay, the important point is that no nation can afford to have the debt GDP ratio go up forever. That way leads bankruptcy.
Right. See Greece.
Exactly. And so therefore it's essential that this spike in the debt GDP ratio is related only to the current deep recession, that when we reach recovery, that this not only flattens out, but actually, as it has in all previous past eras, starts to come back down again. And therefore, it is right to be concerned about annual deficits and the degree of debt. But it is wrong, and this is the fundamental point, to so obsess about deficits and debt that you actually take steps that harm economic growth. Since economic growth, as we've demonstrated over the last 100 years, is the solution to every crisis that we get.
Excellent. That is a great place to finish. I've really enjoyed this conversation. So thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.